Experts say South Africa is in deep trouble, and while it won't be a panacea for all its ills, there is a high expectation for a budget next Wednesday that carves up the country's money cake in ways that will help reverse the adversity wrought by power cuts and other challenges. We are in the throes of two concurrent states of disaster over electricity and flooding, and with estimates from the World Bank revealing our economy shared 400 billion rand last year through power cuts alone, Public Interest Law Centre Section 27 says the poor should not bear the burden of Eskom's financial woes. Budget researcher at Section 27, Matshidiso Lencoasa, joins us now to highlight areas of concern. Good evening to you and welcome. Well, let's start with the most fundamental question. How will the poor bear the brunt of what's happening at Eskom?
Thank you so much for having me. So this basically all eyes are on this year's budget as how the Minister of Finance has announced that there will be a plan for to take on Eskom's debt from 1/3 to 2/3 of the depending. So he hasn't announced that yet, but that is expected. And what we have found over the years is that when government takes on debt, it means that there's an increase in the interest on the debt. And so what that means is that they end up often take out money that should be going to schools, that should be going to hospitals, that should be going to healthcare in order to fund this debt. And so it ends up being that people, the most impoverished people, the people who depend the most on public service, end up being the ones who take on that burden. So the cuts to that funding mean that, there's less money to pay for infrastructure and less money to pay for nurses and teachers.
You talked about, that debt that Eskom alone faces, but we'll talk about our national debt as well, which is staggering. I mean, the interest alone is around R1 trillion. We've got a shrinking tax base. I shared the number around the World Bank and the impact of the power cuts, 400 billion rand, as a consequence of what's been happening at Eskom. Our debt levels are at the highest since the fall of apartheid. How should this budget be designed, Matshidiso, to have maximum impact and in particular create some insularity for the most vulnerable, the poorest of the poor?
Sure. So I think we're all in agreement as a country that we need to end this energy crisis, this energy supply crisis. But in that way, the budget should not be tailored in a way that prioritizes that at the expense of the rights of the constitutional rights of everyone in South Africa, but particularly those most vulnerable. So we're advocating for a human rights-centered approach to the budget, so increasing investment, perceiving expenditure on public services like healthcare and funding, healthcare and education funding as an investment rather than an expense. So we're hoping that it would be tailored. We recommend that it is tailored in a way that that shows like an investment in the infrastructure and investments in personnel to make sure that those education and health constitutional rights are protected during this hard time.
If we look at our debt, and we mentioned that a little bit earlier on, it's estimated at around R1 trillion alone. So it is like this quiet suction on every single rand that is generated into this economy. It's going to take a Herculean effort to be able to claw back from that. You spoke a little bit about the impact on the poor, but the impact on the erosion, this erosion and the corrosive, payments that must come on servicing our debt is going to be seen in things like transport costs. It's going to be seen in things like cost of living. Just take us into that picture.
Yes, so that is true. So that's another level in which South Africans end up bearing the burden of poor policy choices and the financial burden. It almost feels as though money is being thrown into like a bottomless pit of some sort. And so what that means is that when there's less funding for supportive areas of support like public healthcare and education, government pushes the burden onto the everyday consumer. It means that everyday South Africans have to take out money from transport, have to take out money from other areas so that they can stay afloat during this very, very tough circumstance. So it's almost like a vicious cycle of some sort. So we're bearing the burden through the cuts to the budget, but also internally because the government budget impacts household budgets. Those household budgets are shrinking because government is not taking on that supportive structure of upholding education and healthcare services particularly.
So there are two arguments I want to put to you, and the one is, people will say, but there is some cushioning and there is some insularity for the poor through, indigent grants or through social grants. So that should be able to steer them through. But share with us the reality, even of those who are recipients of that grant. Some of them granted maybe the recipients of more than just one grant, but that vulnerability at that level and the inability to sustain another blow, another economic blow.
Yeah, it's true. So with that vulnerability, it is true that government has been allocating funding to social grants, but you'll find that over the past few years, especially over the past since COVID, you'll find that the grants are not increasing in line with inflation. So the value, 1 rand last year is not the same as this year. The 2020 350 rand COVID grants, relief grants, is not worth the same as it is today. So the value of that, so even though it looks like there's money being pursued in that way, because our interest on our debt and our debt is escalating that way, more money, government is spending more money on interest on debt than on any other item. And so it means that every other item of the budget is not increasing the way that it should, align at minimum in line with inflation.
I want you to address, Matshidiso, for us the flawed and pervasive view that it's taxpayers who foot the bill for the country's, debt or money that's needed to be allocated to different departments and so on, and that they come from the employed and people above a certain salary bracket. What are some of the myths that you believe need to be busted when it comes to who actually contributes to the tax base?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because even the term taxpayer, people tend to perceive it as the employed and a certain middle class person, but you'll find that everyone in South Africa pays tax. We all contribute to the economy in some way, like value added taxes, VAT, consumption taxes, many of the taxes, fuel levies, all of those things. Every day South Africans are paying towards that. So even though it seems like there's a dichotomy of the middle class versus the impoverished, we're all actually all in the same struggle, and we're all taxpayers and we're all bearing the brunt of that. Unfortunately, though, people who rely on public health care, people of which 85% of the country do, and people who rely on fee-free schools, 67% of schoolgoers do, they don't have that cushioning. So with the middle class, the employed, the fully employed, those who don't have precarious forms of employment, at least they can say, okay, the education is collapsing, so we're going to take our children to private school, or we're going to use the private healthcare system. Unfortunately, the more impoverished people don't have that option. So we're all in the same struggle, but some people don't have options or access to opportunities to get out of that. And so we should be seeing it as a joint struggle rather than an us versus them.
Well, let's leave it on that note. And I guess all eyes, as you said at the very beginning, are on the finance minister come Wednesday. This is one of the most important budgets. I guess we say that every year, but our twin crises and the states of disaster are creating a bit more pressure around what exactly Godongwana is going to say to the country come Wednesday. That was Section 27 budget researcher Matshidiso Lencoasa.